This is Akashvani. In the program Spotlight, we now bring you a discussion on Forest Conservation Amendment Bill. The participants are Mukul Sanwal, environmentalist, and Sonu Sood, anchor.
Yesterday, Lok Sabha passed the Forest Conservation Amendment Bill 2023. The bill seeks to amend the Forest Conservation Act 1980. To discuss the various aspects of this crucial bill, we have with us Dr. Mukul Sanwal, who is an environment expert. Welcome to Akashvani, Dr. Sanwal.
Thank you.
So we would like to know from you this Forest Conservation Amendment Bill 2023, which has been passed yesterday. What is the major objective of this bill?
When we look at this, the new amendment, we have to see what is being amended. In 1980, we had the Forest Conservation Act, which was in some senses an extreme reaction to what was happening earlier. And this bill, in one sentence, is seeking to restore the balance again. Let me explain. The history of forests in India goes back to 1927, when the British put in the Forest Act. And all the forests in the country, which were basically village forests, because the state didn't have much role or didn't have any interest except the kings going for shikar. So they nationalized all the forest and they made it into a central regulatory, under a central regulatory authority, and excluded the people from its purview in a sense. So what they did was, they looked at forests and said, here is a commercial resource, and if we can exploit the timber, we will call it a reserve forest, and from there, timber will flow out, we will get some revenue, and some parts around the villages we will leave for the villagers. So the primary focus was not in terms of conservation, not in terms of the environment, but in terms of the timber value of this land. It came to such an extreme that even after independence, much of this thinking continued, and between 1951 and 1976, we lost 42 lakh hectares. And the natural consequence of that was the need to control. And when you think in terms of control, you control very firmly. That is how governments work. So the Forest Conservation Act of 1980 put a stop to all activities in forests, had a very expanded definition of forests, and said very clearly that for the sake of the environment, we have to protect this forest from the people. I think that is what the present criticism is missing, that the 1980 Act deliberately chose, because of the history of forest or exploitation, as I would like to call it, up to that time, to keep people away from forests. Now, the impact of this, for example, in Uttarakhand was that people were not able to, villagers in remote areas were not able to get timber for their housing, for their roofs, for their walls, for their doors. There are no roads, there are no shops. You see, there are things which we assume in a city, that you can buy timber. You cannot do that in a remote forest. They could not get fodder for their animals because any movement inside the forest could be punished. And who were the people committing this so-called crime? It was the women. Because the men were down in the plains working for a living and sending back money to their wives. So throughout that period, it was noticed that the so-called crime was being committed by women who were being challaned or sent to even jail, and it was causing a lot of resentment. You could not put up a school because of the 1980 Forest Conservation Act, which said all these activities are not allowed because they affect the conservation of the forest. Now, what have we done now? First of all, I think the thinking behind it is that we have deleted the word forest and used the word one. When you say forest, the environmentalist compares it with the definition of forest in the international sphere, where in no country do you have the kind of population that you have, the numbers of population that you have inside forests. No country. And therefore, the thinking here has to be that we are protecting forests for the people, not from the people. And this thinking was necessitated because in 1996, the Supreme Court, interpreting this act, the implementation of the act, said, no, you are talking about forest conservation, and you are talking about forests. Now, the forests have a dictionary meaning, and conservation means maintaining the ecological balance, so activities cannot be permitted because of the legislation you have brought in. See, again, the critics are now misleading the nation in a sense, because it is not that the Supreme Court judgment is being violated. Supreme Court only interprets the law as Parliament has legislated it. So Supreme Court said, this is what you have legislated and this is what it means. So please follow what you have legislated. So it was necessary to bring a new legislation with new thinking because the national needs have changed. Just as the needs in 1927 were to sell timber. Today the need is that we need access to the people, they need to be given access, and new thinking, new methods of control, a new situation has emerged, and it is in response to that new situation that this act has come. So it is neither anti-environment, nor is it anti-Supreme Court. It is pro-people, pro-nation, pro-economic development with a new balance. I think that is the other second point that the critics are missing. Just as earlier there was an ecological balance was considered without giving any reference to the people. Today we are giving reference to the people, and within that context we are looking at the ecological balance. So a new balance is emerging, and if we look at the details, in this new balance, you will find that there is nothing anti-national in this.
In fact, if we talk about the provisions of the Forest Conservation Amendment Bill 2023, it exempts certain types of land from the purview of the Act. Can you tell us about this aspect? For what purposes have these exemptions been made?
You see, there's a lot of criticism that 100-kilometer belt along the national boundary has been exempted. No, it has not been exempted. What they have said is that in this area, because of national security or national economic needs, or the needs of the local people, there will be no restriction. Of course, there will be rules, but the activity will not be considered a violation of the Act, which was the case in the 1980 Act. A road built to the border area, a border village connected to the mainland, to the district headquarters, was all banned under the 1980 Act because that is how we had legislated it. So the ban was not because of the environment, but ban was because of the legislation. Now what they have said is that if you have constructed a road, you don't need to take permission. Of course, the Government of India will give permission, but it's not a violation of the law. Similarly, up to 10 hectares in the border areas, you can set up some establishment. Now, what are the kind of establishment that will be set up near the border areas? It will be security related. Or for the villagers, it will be their schools, their hospitals, or any other municipal facilities. Even drinking water pipes going through the reserve forest needed permission. That caused delay. Delay means increase in cost. Increase means that people are deprived of a benefit. Similarly, along the roadside, you could not construct any shops or, say, toilets or any other facilities, which have been a feature throughout. We assume we build an expressway, we have places where you can stop and have a snack. We can use a toilet. But that was not allowed in the forest areas where you had the Forest Conservation Act. So it had gone down to that extreme because of the legislation or the thinking in Parliament at that time. Similarly, we'll come to another aspect of change in the country as a whole. Today, as I said, for the British it was timber. And then that thinking continued to the mid-70s, 80s. And now we find that the new thinking is, how do you protect animals in the wildlife reserves? Do you protect them by keeping people out? Or do you protect them by regulating human activity so that it keeps away the poachers? In almost every game sanctuary in this country, the people who were living inside the forest, not very many, but few, were thrown out, virtually thrown out, because the thinking was that you cannot have anybody inside the boundary of the reserve forest, and you have to keep people out. But that did not stop poaching. The experience throughout the world, particularly in Africa, has been that some kind of controlled activity is the best way to protect the animals and the ecosystem from poachers. Because the problem is not the people. The people who are killing tigers are not the villagers living inside, the few villagers living inside, but the poachers from outside.
Absolutely. Sir, the Act also specifies some activities that can be carried out in forests, such as establishing checkposts, fencing and bridges, and also allows running zoos, safaris and ecotourism facilities. It also talks about encouraging agroforestry. Can you tell us a little bit about these aspects, how they are going to help in the direction of restoring balance, as you said in the beginning?
The more commercial activity, there are two types of activities here. One is the more commercial activity, ecotourism things. And the other is the individual kind of activity, a checkpost, or somebody who is a small plot holder. And today, under the Forest Conservation Act, was not able to cut a tree inside his own little plot to build his own house, because that was the law. So now that was creating a dampener. People were saying, even on the boundaries or even a couple of trees, if I can plant them in my little plot, I don't want to do it, because if I need to cut them because they are blocking the sunlight, or because I need to put up another room, my family is increased in size, I will not get the permission. So I will not do this activity. So that is agroforestry in a sense. Now that has been extended, that there are barren areas which are designated as forests. Because the forest, designation of forest by the British was not done in terms of density of trees, but in terms of a territory. This entire area is designated as a forest, whether it has forest cover or not. Now some of those barren plots can be handed over to the private sector, to NGOs, to plant trees, and they can exploit them to a limited extent, regulated, and in that manner we can extend the forest cover and regulate it, as I said. It is not that you will sell this land. Similarly for mining, yes, there is some destruction, but we need the coal, for example. Imported coal is expensive. It means more expensive electricity. It means people can't afford electricity. Half of India is almost developed country, but the other half is poorer than Africa. So when we look at our policies, it's not just the urban middle class who is concerned about that this area must remain pristine so that I can go for a hike or I can go for travel. But what about the other half who lives around these forest areas because they are spread up throughout the country and who need these resources for their own livelihood? The new act will allow people to enjoy the forest, the urban middle class, ecotourism, but that will be controlled. The mining will be permitted, but that again will be controlled. So what we are basically saying is that as the development of the state has taken place, as half of us have urbanized and half are still very poor, we need a transition in our policies. I would say basically this is a transition from what the British did to the 1980 Act, which went to another extreme, and now some new balance is emerging. And what we have to really see is not in terms of how the Western thinking has developed with respect to forests, because their forests have virtually no one living inside the forest. Here we have a huge population living inside or dependent on forests, for one. And two, we have needs of infrastructure development because there is no other way you can develop a remote village, whether it is in the forest or in the Himalayas, without connecting it to a road. When people say that public projects and 100 kilometers of the border area is destructive, the question I want to ask them, have you visited that site? Do you know what the condition of the people is? Do you know what will happen with that couple of hectares of land which will be used by security agencies, and will it make a difference? Or if take up 5 hectares and plant trees on the boundary, will it be beneficial? So without asking these questions, people are criticizing a bill which is part of the evolution of the country, which has checks and balances inherent in it.
So you feel that this controlled development will benefit the forest dwellers, the rural population, the tribal habitations especially?
See, I have not come across, in the newspaper at least, any criticism by tribals living inside the forest areas about this bill. It is people who are living in cities who are complaining. Second point is that this is a democracy. If the people are upset, you will find out during the next election. There will be complaints in the panchayat. And this is what was happening in Uttarakhand. In Uttarakhand, there was a concept of village forest where people were allowed to go and collect daily needs, bona fide domestic use. Any timber that went out was regulated and was not allowed. But their bona fide domestic use was taken account of. The Forest Conservation Act put a stop to that, and there was resentment. There is still resentment. Ultimately, what is happening is that government is taking a blind eye and saying, if you want to use it yourself, go ahead, we will not say anything. But when it comes to construction of a road, someone goes to the court and gets a stay. Not because it is anti-environment, but because it is against the law made at that time. I think that distinction the critics have not understood, that the new development is not anti-environment. It is only redefining the law, because the courts enforce the law. Supreme Court has never said that this activity is bad or wrong. They have only said your own law says this is the criteria that has to be followed, so I am following it. It is because of that that you needed a new legislation to have a new balance and have a new kind of thinking coming up, which goes down, as I said earlier, by changing the name of forest to one. If that is the right approach, that this is what this country needs and this is how we will evaluate it.
Absolutely. It's so important to change with the changing times, adapt, and that is what this Forest Conservation Amendment Bill 2023 is trying to do. Thank you so much, Dr. Sanwal, for this enlightening discussion on the various aspects of this path-breaking bill.
Thank you.
You were listening to a discussion on Forest Conservation Amendment Bill. The participants were Mukul Sanwal, environmentalist, and Sonu Sood, anchor. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of Akashvani. You can listen to it on our mobile app, News on AIR.